What if I told you you're going bankrupt? Now, let me clarify before you go check your bank app or think about your mortgage. I'm not talking about your checking account. Your credit score is probably fine. What I'm talking about is this invisible, unrecorded deficit that's growing inside of your psyche. Think about some time when you were halfway to the door to do something and somebody asks you for a favor. Or maybe you get a text from a friend asking you to attend some kind of event that you just have no energy for. Instead of saying, I can't make it, you feel that familiar sinking sensation and you say, sure, no problem at all. In that moment, you feel a momentary sense of relief. The social friction was avoided, there was no awkwardness. But here's the catch. Every time you say yes when your soul is screaming no, you're taking out a high interest emotional loan. You just borrowed energy and authenticity from your future self to pay for a moment of temporary peace. And like any predatory payday loan, the interest rates are astronomical. If we don't learn how to audit this invisible debt, we risk losing our most valuable asset, our identity. Today, we're going to take a look at the mechanics of emotional debt and how to start the process of psychological restructuring. When these emotional debt loans take place, it's really important to understand what we're actually trading. Think of your personal boundaries as a form of currency. In a healthy social ecosystem, boundaries are used to define where you end and where someone else begins. But for the chronic people pleaser, these boundaries become something entirely different. They become a currency that we use to buy temporary harmony. When we make these emotional trade offs, it's really important to understand what we're actually trading. Think of your personal boundaries as a form of currency. In a healthy social ecosystem, boundaries are used to define where you end and where someone else begins. But for the chronic people pleaser, boundaries become something entirely different. They become a currency and they're used to buy temporary harmony. When we encounter social friction, a disagreement, or the fear of being perceived as difficult, we feel an immediate impulse to resolve it. The easiest way to settle that is self-sacrifice. It's a transaction. You trade a piece of your autonomy for a moment of social ease. It feels like a bargain in that moment. I'll just stay an extra hour, or it's not a big deal. But essentially, what this is social lending. You're settling a minor inconvenience today by committing to a larger debt tomorrow. And the problem is we keep this internal ledger and we don't even realize it. Every time we override our own needs to appease someone else, a line item gets recorded in these mental books. We think we're being nice, we think we're being easygoing, but the ledger doesn't record kindness. It records a deficit of self. We're essentially spending ourselves away one problem at a time. And this is where things get dangerous. In finance, compound interest is what makes wealth grow exponentially. In emotional debt, compound interest is what makes burnout inevitable. A single yes when you meant no, it's not going to ruin your life. It's a small transaction. But these acts of appeasement, they don't exist in a vacuum. They accumulate. They stack up on top of each other, kind of like layers of unwashed dishes. Over time, this creates a huge psychological deficit. You start to experience a profound and almost unexplainable fatigue. It's not just the I need a nap kind of tired either. It's a deep cellular exhaustion. It comes from the sheer effort of maintaining a curated and agreeable persona. Think about how much cognitive energy it takes to constantly monitor your responses, to filter your opinions, and to ensure that you're projecting the version of yourself that others find easy or helpful. It's exhausting to be an actor in your own life. And then there's the interest payment, and that comes in the form of resentment. And this is probably the most insidious part of this whole debt. When you spend all your energy catering to the needs of, and the expectations of other people, eventually you run out of capital. You start to feel this simmering anger toward the very people you're trying so hard to please. The debt, it manifests as bitterness because you're essentially being robbed, not by them, but by your own refusal to enforce your boundaries. And the debt never gets paid with repaid with an apology. It's paid in the currency of resentment. It's paid in the currency of burnout. This erosion of your authentic identity starts when the bankruptcy becomes total. It happens when you've spent so much of yourself to keep everyone else happy that there's nothing left in your own account. When you're chronically people pleasing, you begin to lose touch with your genuine preferences. You might find yourself sitting in a restaurant, looking at a menu, and realizing you actually have no idea what you want to eat because you've spent so many years simply choosing whatever the person across from you suggested. Psychologists often call this the mirroring trap. Instead of being an autonomous individual with a solid core, you become a reflection of the expectations of people around you. You learn to mirror the values, the moods, the desires of whoever's standing in front of you, because reflecting them ensures social stability and approval. It's like living your life through a series of mirrors. It looks pretty and it keeps the peace, but there's no you at the center of that image. There's only a collection of reflections. And the most terrifying moment isn't when you realize that you're tired. It's that moment of realization when you look at your life and you feel like a stranger in your own biography. You look at the decisions you've made and you think, wait, did I actually want to do this? Or was I just following the script? That's the feeling of total emotional insolvency. What does it take to stop the bleeding and begin a restructuring of the soul? We have to start with some self reflection. You need to look at the relationships you have and ask some very uncomfortable questions. You need to distinguish between relationships that are based on mutual respect and those built on parasitic pleasing. In a relationship built on respect, there's room for you to say no. There's space for disagreement without the fear of abandonment. In a parasitic relationship, your value is tied entirely to your utility, how much you can do, and how well you can conform. If someone only seems happy when you're being easy, that person isn't really a friend. They're a creditor. Another part of the self reflection is identifying your triggers. What are the specific social pressures that lead to your impulsive emotional overspending? Is it a fear of conflict? A need for external validation? Or maybe just an old habit learned from childhood where being good was the only way to feel safe. Now, honestly, that first no is it's going to feel terrible. It'll feel like you're defaulting on a loan. You might feel guilty, you might feel anxious, or you might even feel physical discomfort. This isn't because you're doing anything wrong. It's because you're undergoing unnecessary restructuring. You're reallocating your resources back into your own savings. It, it's your sense of self. Yeah, and it's uncomfortable. But the goal is to move away from a state of constant deficit to a state of emotional solvency. Ultimately, the goal isn't to become someone who's difficult or rude or selfish. That's a whole different form of emotional and spiritual debt. The real goal is sovereignty. Reclaiming your internal sovereignty means setting boundaries that act as protective reserves for your mental energy. Don't think of boundaries as walls to keep people out. Think of them as fences to protect the garden that you're growing inside. Fences have gates. They allow for connection, but they also define where your space begins. The only way to achieve long-term emotional solvency is through radical honesty. And that means being honest about your own capacity and your own limits. It might mean some people walk away from this new version of you. They enjoyed the old one. That was the version that always was available and never had an opinion. And that's okay. Because here's the beautiful irony. When you stop spending yourself to buy temporary peace, you finally have enough left over to build something real. Deep, authentic connections can't be built on a foundation of lies or forced compliance. True intimacy requires two whole people, not one person and one reflection. By reclaiming your time and energy, you aren't just saving yourself from bankruptcy. You're finally making the investment that's required to live a life that's actually yours. Stop spending yourself away. Start investing in yourself. If this helped you decide to make a renewed commitment to your real self, consider subscribing. We'll continue talking about this topic and others related to purpose and meaning as we continue to take this journey. So thanks for watching. Take good care.